Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrera here and Betty for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. We are doing our Source Saturday series today, and the Source Saturday series is me talking with a historian or a creator about a primary source or a secondary interpretation that brings out elements of the past that challenge kind of our traditional readings of a historical period. And I draw on my concept of historic space that I've been working on for about 20 years. The new website is up now. I don't know if you can hear that construction outside. It is going to be a fun video, I can tell. Cat, construction, etc., etc. That I've brought in this idea of historic space, that we teach our students kind of the traditional understanding of the period, but then the most of the time we spent challenging that historical period with sources and interpretations that allow us to see the complexities of the history, to allow us to understand these histories as a counter story to the ways that we usually teach history. And you can see that Betty is like super psyched about that. Nope, she's not. She just wants to leave. Today we have a really wonderful historian, and I'm so excited because his collaborative SSHRC-funded project launches right now. It launched on September 26th, Landscapes of Injustice, and I definitely hope you take a look at their website, look at the stuff that they have, but I can't wait to be able to talk with this historian about one source that is used on their website, but also can be used in a lesson that isn't necessarily like crafted by their website. Today I'm talking with Jordan StangerRoss. He is a professor, associate professor at the University of Victoria, and he's the project director of Landscapes of Injustice. It is a SSHRC-funded partnership related to the dispossession of Japanese Canadians in the 1940s. Now, I know a lot of you history teachers, you might teach a little bit about this, but this website provides so many primary sources and lesson plans to help you bring in this history in more substantial ways. And that's why it's really exciting to be able to talk to Jordan. Jordan also is a dad. He has 3 kids. Those kids ask him questions all the time. And I think that like creating a project like this, when you have kids around, when you're teaching kids, when you're like thinking about the questions that kids ask, it really helps illuminate so many different things that often we as experts kind of forget. And that's one of the reasons why I love doing this series. So let's go over to Zoom and talk with Jordan. Hi, Jordan. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk about the source that you're bringing to this Source Saturday conversation. Before we get started, do you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll just jump right on in?
Sure. Thanks, Samantha. I'm a associate professor of history at the University of Victoria, where I also direct the Landscapes of Injustice project, which is a national research project on the dispossession of the property of Japanese Canadians. And I think for this conversation, it's probably relevant that from the start of this research, I've been working with teachers at secondary and elementary levels. So they were involved in the research process and presentations from the beginning, and asking questions that they thought were relevant to their students. And then they've developed teacher resources out of our research or in connection with our research. And that's been one of the really fantastic pleasures of the work. The teachers have been wonderful to work with, and I've just been also impressed with teachers and the way in which they approach difficult topics. So it's exciting for me to do this, to have the opportunity to do this interview and to talk a little bit further about the use of these materials in classrooms.
And the website launched September 26th, right?
That's right. So we have websites that are being developed for elementary school teachers and for secondary school teachers. The elementary school website is still just finishing up its development process, so it's not quite going to launch yet. But folks should look for it. It'll be at the same at the same place as the secondary resources. And then our resources for secondary teachers in conjunction with the launch of our museum exhibit, which is starting its show at the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby on the same date.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And, you know, we were saying right before we started filming that I didn't think I knew about the whole like website with teacher resources when we got in touch. And so it's so fantastic that like the timing just worked really well. And when we take a look at the source that we're going to be looking at today, you even identify right here how it connects with one of the lessons. And while we're not necessarily going to talk about that lesson today, we're going to talk more about the source. It's really fantastic that teachers can go to the website to be able to think about lessons specifically towards this. So yeah, what excellent timing for us.
Yeah, it's great. And that lesson and all the handouts have been developed, you know, by teachers, for teachers. So hopefully people find them really usable and useful. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get right into it. So we have 3 questions. The first is just tell me about this source. So what is this source that you have provided to us? What is the source that you've provided to us?
Yeah, so this is a letter that I first read. I was actually in a little kind of shack in Nova Scotia, and I was reading through records that the Canadiana project had put online. So those were records of the Library and Archives Canada that had just been digitized en masse with no finding aid, thousands of pages of records. And I was reading along through those thousands of pages of records, and I came across, so they're microfilmed records. These were all destroyed in the early 1950s, the originals, but they were microfilmed at the time, and they're available now online. I came across what would have been the front of a file that had been assembled by folks in the Office of the Custodian of Enemy Property, which was a wartime agency that dated to the First World War, responsible for the property of at that time, and until its handling of Japanese Canadian-owned property, it was responsible for the control of the assets of people who were enemy aliens. So those would be people who were perhaps residing in a country with which Canada was at war, who owned property in Canada, or a relatively small number, several hundreds of people of, say, for example, German or Italian nationality who were living in Canada and were suspected of some connection with that enemy power. And so that had always been the function of the custodian of enemy property. And there are custodians of enemy property in other jurisdictions that hold property in times of war, times of conflict like this, even stocks and bonds that Germans may have owned in Canadian companies and so on. So in 1943, 42, 43, starting in March 42, the federal government used that agency to control the property of Japanese Canadians, so Canadian citizens, Canadian-born folks, in addition to Japanese nationals, so folks who were not enemy aliens by any definition, and seize their property and assume control of it. And so, and then that agency assembled this file called protests, and this letter was inside that file. So bureaucrats put together a file, and it was actually on the instruction of the head of that office, said, put together a file of protests that we're getting. Because what happened was the federal government started to inform Japanese Canadians, as we can see in this letter, started to inform Japanese Canadians that their property was being sold, contrary to prior assurances. And Japanese Canadians wrote thousands of letters to federal officials about this. There's a huge, there's 300,000 pages probably of correspondence between the federal government and Japanese Canadians of various kinds. files relating to their property. And so folks became concerned. People are really pissed off about what's going on. And so we should be documenting this somehow. So this file is actually a selection of letters from that mass of correspondence that government officials deemed representative of the protest that they were receiving. And so this is one. And it's written by Aya Suzuki, who is the aunt of the famous Canadian environmentalist, David Suzuki, or was the aunt of the famous Canadian environmentalist. And she wrote this letter. So there's about 300 letters in the file. I think 6 or so are on the Teacher Resource website. This was written in, if you go to the top, I think we'll see it was written in 1944. If you just go up to, so we can see the date line, yeah, in early 1944. So about a year after, almost exactly a year after the federal government decided it was going to force the sale of this property. And so it's informing Japanese Canadians that their property's been sold. And so this is one of the thousands of responses that officials received, one of hundreds that they decided was worth putting in this folder of protests. It would have been a handwritten letter that they've typed out. The original remains in her case file, and they've typed it out for their records here. And so I was in that shack in Nova Scotia, and I was just arrested by these letters. Just very powerful, very diverse statements of protest. So, so this is one of those. That's a long answer to that question, I know, but this is one of those letters that Japanese Canadians wrote in protest when they found out their property was being sold.
That is, that's a fascinating long answer. All the details are very relevant. It's so interesting that there is a file compiled of protests and that someone chose ones that were representative. It's kind of interesting to think about, like, what did representative mean? Do you have any sense of that?
So they were worried. All through the process of forcing the sale of these properties, officials knew that this was questionable because these are Canadians. This is not the normal operations of the office, and they knew that Japanese Canadians, they started to get these responses, and they knew Japanese Canadians would seek to hold the government to account. So if you go to the very top of this letter, we can see, I do not wish to appear rude, and it is not my intention, you can stop there, it is not my intention, but I would like to put the facts before you in withholding signatures for this case until the court appeal is settled upon. And so what Suzuki is referencing here is that as soon as Japanese Canadians became aware that their properties are being sold without their consent, they launched a legal appeal. And so she knows that there's a legal appeal. This is being challenged in what we would call a federal court. It doesn't exist anymore, but the Exchequer Court, but that's a federal court where they've launched a challenge to challenge the legality of these sales. And so officials know that these are Canadians who are going to seek in various ways through individual actions like this, where the government is seeking the signatures and documents of ownership from Japanese Canadians as part of their transaction to the custodian, which is then going to sell to new buyers. And a number of Japanese Canadians withheld those previous deeds and their signature on these sales. That didn't stop the sales. The government went ahead with them anyway. But they were these individual acts of resistance. We see a letter like this, and then there was collective resistance as well through a court appeal. And so officials know this is going on. They know that there will be questions. They anticipate that there will be questions likely in the post-war, and there ended up being a royal commission. And so they're concerned. So they start they start compiling this documentation. And then when the Royal Commission was established in 1947, the head of this office put together, a guy by the name of Frank Shears, he went through this file of 300 letters on the request of government lawyers and put together a kind of sampling of what he called typical, it's this paragraph that has quotes from these hundreds of letters. I think it quotes about 19 letters, trying to give them a feel for what Japanese Canadians are likely to testify to at the Royal Commission. So there's a kind of a concern about legality that runs through the whole process of the dispossession.
Yeah, that's so interesting about, there, especially related to, so one of my kind of historical research interests is mid-19th century and slavery. And one of the things you often hear is like, people didn't know slavery was bad. And it's like, well, slaves knew slavery was bad. And there's a lot of evidence that people did know that slavery was immoral. And I think something like this dispossession of land for Japanese Canadians, one could also make the argument like, well, the government just thought they were doing what they needed to do. They didn't know it was bad. And one of the things I'm hearing from the way that you're articulating this is their very clear position that they knew they were in murky territory and they really needed to kind of cover themselves while engaging in these acts that they knew were not maybe moral or ethical. Thoughts on that kind of big idea?
Yeah. So, and we can get to the details of this letter, which are fascinating themselves. And I would think if teachers use this letter in their classroom, there are aspects here that are, there are these kind of big contextual questions, and then the letter itself is very striking. But obviously, a question that arises, and will probably arise in every classroom, I would think, in which this is taught, is, well, it's a time of war, right? People were panicking. There was real uncertainty at the beginning of Canada's entry into the Pacific War, about security on the West Coast and so on. And in times of panic, people do things that we can now look back on, in retrospect and question. And there is a discussion, I think, to be had that can be had in classrooms. What do we owe one another at times of perceived national insecurity? What rights should people like Japanese Canadians still retain? That's one set of discussions. But the dispossession of property and documents like this and the wider teacher resource of which this is a part, I think points to a different way of looking at this history. And that's to recognize that a time of war actually disguises a much longer process. Canada's wartime changed over time. It was different. Canada's, December 1941 was a quite different moment from 1944, say, when I is writing. And the kinds of decisions that went into the dispossession of property were not made in a panic in 1941. It wasn't a single decision reaction to the bombing in Hong Kong or Pearl Harbor. There were thousands of decisions that were made over time to dispossess Japanese Canadians of everything that they own. And no one involved in that process imagined that forcing the sale of the property that Japanese Canadians had been forced to leave behind, or forcing the sale of the homes that they had assured Japanese Canadians they would preserve and protect, that those would somehow increase security on the Pacific Coast. No one thought that. And so when we start to see, oh wow, the policies were not a moment of panic, they were years upon years of hundreds of decisions to continue to deny the basic rights of people about whom there were no security concerns stated at any serious level within the federal government. then we need to ask, why does that happen? Why in 44, when the Prime Minister has announced that that the war has turned in favor of the Allies, that it's not really a question of whether Canada will win, and the Allies will win, but rather when. Why in that summer, when the Prime Minister is making that speech in the House of Commons, why are they feverishly selling hundreds of properties of Japanese Canadians and auctioning off their personal belongings? Why do they have concerns about the legality of these actions and collect their protests into a file and yet continue the sales? The answers have something. The answer to those questions requires something beyond, it was a time of war, or we can't look back and question. There were lots of questions that people were asking at the time. So there were folks certainly in government who questioned the ethics of the policy, but even the people who thought it was the right thing to do, some of them very committed racists, were concerned about the legality of it also. Mm-hmm. So yes, we would like to dispossess Japanese Canadians of their property, is the perspective of some officials, but is it legal? And what do we need to do to ensure that it's legal? And so some of these, and what kinds of legal challenges will we face? And so some of their actions reflect that concern about legality.
Yeah, thank you for that. That really provides a lot of extra context to the discussion that I don't necessarily think we always kind of allowed to come up or like bring up in our conversation. And I do want to get to content, but right before that, can you just answer a couple quick questions of the content? For example, why would she be writing from a post box? Who is P.H. Russell? What does she mean by letter of third instant? And why does she sign with a number at the end? Would you be able to just tell us those quick things? And then we can kind of get into the meat of her letter.
Sure, I think I can answer most of those questions.
Okay.
So she's writing from Slocan City, which is one of the sites of internment of Japanese Canadians. The Japanese Canadians were in many varied sites and were housed in varied ways in those different sites. In Slocan City, I believe most Japanese Canadians were in housing that existed before the internment, abandoned housing and other kinds of buildings that were repurposed for the purpose of internment. In other sites in the Slocan Valley, they were in purpose-built shacks and tents, even for tents for parts of internment. So that's where she's writing from, a former resident of Vancouver. I'm not sure why she provides the number, but I guess that's how they collect it. This is not a big, I've been to Slocan City over the last couple of years. It's not a big place. Maybe that's how they, were collecting mail at that time. She's writing to an individual bureaucrat in the office of the custodian who presumably was the signatory on the letter that informed her on the 3rd of January that she's referring to, that the property was sold. And her reaction is this strong reaction, as she says, just this paragraph. So the 3rd paragraph that starts with the 4. If you scroll down a little bit. So she says, before leaving Vancouver, your men told us that this process was to protect us, and that and we trusted our property to you. And this is a promise that was given to Japanese Canadians when they were uprooted and interned. It was a promise, as we can see here, that local agents repeated to Japanese Canadians, that the federal government put into Japanese Canadian newspapers, and also that was written into Canadian law. There's an order in council that very explicitly says this is a protective measure only. It is to protect the interests of the owners, Japanese Canadian owners of those property. In their interest, while they are in internment, we will hold their property in trust for them. And so there's a law passed to that effect. Japanese Canadians are attentive to that law. They talk about it in their community papers. They seek details. What's that really going to mean? But individual homeowners and residents leave with that explicit assurance repeated on multiple levels that this is a trust, that the agency will act as a legal trust to hold their property for them. So then on the 3rd of January, 1944, and she would have known already, she would likely have heard from other folks, and she knew the court appeal was launched in 43. So she knew before the 3rd, but some Japanese Canadians write, I had heard that this was happening to other folks, but I had been given such a clear assurance, or maybe they thought other people's property was in different circumstances, or, you know, for whatever reason, special cases, but then they get the letter saying, we've sold your property, here's the amount. And so she's reacting to that letter and saying, well, you know, there was a very clear assurance offered us. There was a promise made in law, and now it's been broken. And then you had a question. Oh, and then she's indicated there are various numbers that Japanese Canadians had associated with them. So this would be one of two numbers. It's either the registration number from 1941, when Japanese Canadians were forced to register with police authorities, or that could be her custodian case file number. One of the really gratifying aspects of the project has been that Library and Archives Canada became a partner on our project, and they digitized all of the case files of Japanese Canadians. So it's about 15,000 case files, like I said, about 300,000 pages of records. And so for instance, this file, I think that Aya Suzuki's file has been provided to her family. Japanese Canadians have been requesting them from our project, and we've been providing the case files to families, and they'd be able to go through and find this letter in its original form within that case file, and that numbering system kind of leads us to that case file. And if we go down a paragraph further beyond this one, some folks discover that, and I don't know the case, I don't know what Aya was like as an aunt, you know, within her family, but some folks discover that their father, their grandfather, or even father in some instances, or an aunt or an uncle, who always seemed perhaps to have been the type of person who wouldn't protest so forcefully, the type of person who may be accepted as inevitable, or sought for the family to move on from the injustice that had occurred. They realized, my goodness, this person wrote a really forceful letter of protest, and they see a side of that ancestor of theirs, you know, in many cases that they had never previously known. And so this is one of those documents that someone might find in their case file, and see, wow, she was angry, and she wrote an angry letter, and a powerful letter in protest. And this letter is unusual, but not unique. Unusual in making this connection between the treatment of Jewish people under the Nazis and the treatment of Japanese Canadians in Canada. And so that's one, I think, of the reasons that the teachers selected this for inclusion in their lessons, is that this is a really, you know, seemingly from our perspective at least, a provocative claim that Suzuki makes in relation to her mistreatment.
So that leads me to, let's talk a little bit about content, and maybe we can pull out a few more sentences. about like what as a historian you read from this letter, like both in terms of content, so we covered some of that, but also in terms of like the metaphoric significance or the analytic significance, that's a better way of saying it, of some of the things that you read from this letter. I want to just pop in something that I really noted when you sent this to me about, I don't want to appear rude. And I think a lot about the Black Lives Matter protests from this particular summer, in which mainly white people are saying like, oh, we don't want the riots, and activists, Black activists, people of color, Indigenous people are like, we have done things that are like nonviolent protests, and these aren't riots, these are protests that we're trying to get your attention. And so I see this here in this kind of introduction about this balance between like, look, I don't want you to think I'm being angry and aggressive, but I am angry and aggressive, and I need you to understand that this is unjust. And so I just wanted to point that out as something that I read from this letter, like this kind of historical balance that many people of color had to make between working with larger systems of white supremacy, politics, law, about demanding their rights, but in ways that's like, I still want you to agree with me and not think I'm scary. So I don't know if you want to start with that. What are things that you read from this letter?
Yeah, absolutely. How do you protest? How do you resist injustice? What are the best means and strategies, right? The elementary school resources are built around this kind of dispossession activity, and those will launch soon. And in those ones, students write their own letters of protest. They use these, there's a whole bit that comes before that, but it kind of culminates in a sense, or that aspect of the lesson culminates in them writing letters of protest. And they're really, and so then the students ask themselves, how would I express this to officials in this unequal, unjust system in which, I'm trying to accomplish something. And the letters are very diverse in this respect. Some are extremely polite. Even this one, which is not a polite letter, has a kind of gesture in that direction, both at the beginning here and then at the end. I think it, if we go down, this seems as if we're not cooperating, so there's, I'm sure you will understand when you put yourselves in our position. These are further rhetorical strategies that Japanese Canadians are using, because they are, I think some of them lost faith, and the officials at the time knew that they had lost faith that these letters could affect change. They at a certain point, and I'm not sure about this letter, at a certain point they were writing to simply express their grievance to officials. But
and even this last sentence, I hope things will clear up soon. It's just like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. maybe I don't know, maybe it was just some paperwork.
Yeah, so this one maybe moves back and forth between, so we have some that are clearly, we have some that are just a line that will say something like, I don't approve the sale. Thank you for your letter, I'm not approving this sale.
Right.
Even though the government had denuded them of that right, I think some of those still are under the impression that they have the opportunity to deny it, or some are very careful. I really try to convey that they were raising children, that their children are Canadian, that they've been Canadian citizens for 30 years, that they need this property in order to be able to send their children to university, for example. And those seem very, really trying to elicit in officials some empathy for their situation and to seek to turn things around. This paragraph here, where yeah, so some of these things that you've highlighted, that's right. So those take that mode. But this paragraph is really interesting, and the letter is interesting, I think, in moving across different ways of trying to either express grievance and or convince officials to change what they're doing. Yeah, appeals to citizenship. And so you're highlighting. So, I mean, it's just one of these letters where every line really you could kind of really spend time with and try to think through the thinking that goes into writing it. I will say, of the analogy to Nazi Germany, one of the things that I find interesting about this, and I've written about it somewhere else than the main book, Landscapes of Injustice, although I think I actually mentioned it there as well. But in any event, there's actually a lot of discussion of Nazis at the time. So officials talk about Nazis both in opposition to the policy. Sometimes they'll say, we don't want to seem like Nazis, so why is this law so racially organized? So they have a law where they say people, essentially, I'm not going to get the wording quite right, which is unfortunate, but people partially or wholly of the Japanese race. And that notion of a kind of quantum of race, a kind of measurement of race in that way, it upsets some officials. And they say, look, we can't write laws that sound like Nazi law. And those are internal communications of the government. So they'll use the notion of being like Nazis in their communications with one another. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King talks about Nazis publicly, and how the Canadian policy toward Japanese Canadians is not like that of the Nazis, because they're going to respect their property rights and treat Japanese Canadians fairly. These are public pronouncements by the Prime Minister. And then civil liberties and civil rights organizations, as they start to become concerned, especially in 1946, about what's been happening to Japanese Canadians, and 47 and so on, they also appeal to Nazis. So Nazis have become already in this period a kind of archetype of state wrongdoing. But while Nazi continues to have that role, rhetorical role, right? It can be used. It can be used as a kind of an insult and so on to attack a policy. And so, the Globe and Mail runs editorials in 46 saying Nazism in Canada and so on. So I've thought about, so what is it that Suzuki is doing with the use of Nazi here? Those different uses of the comparison have been interesting to me, and different from a class students might reasonably have the argument, is it fair to say that this treatment is like the Nazis? And I think maybe people could have a debate about that. Certainly, Suzuki's making arguments here about the denial of citizenship and rights, and certainly Jews in Nazi Germany were stripped of property rights. So there's a discussion to have about that. For me, I've been more interested in the history of the comparison itself. That is, what are people, rather than the legitimacy of the comparison, but rather the fact of the comparison historically, that people did it in the 1940s. They made this comparison. What were they trying to do when they did so? What were they saying? And to me, in this letter and a couple of others that are similar, there's a kind of, I think of it as a kind of a pulling together and pulling apart of the policies. So on the one hand, Suzuki is saying, your policies are like that of the Nazis. Why are you denying us this right to our homes and belongings that, and it can serve no benefit in the war. So why, other than racism, are you stripping us of the homes that we built? At the same time, I think she's pushing the policies apart and saying, you can't be like Nazis. That is, we're Canadian citizens. This isn't Nazi Germany. We're Canadian citizens. That means something. So actually, the policy in Canada can't be like Nazi Germany. So there's a kind of drawing together and pulling apart that maybe she hopes can convince officials that if that analogy strikes home at all for them, if they can come to believe her that the treatment is something like that of the Nazis giving to the Jews, as she says here, that could convince them that that can't be their policy, therefore, because it can't be the policy of Canadian bureaucrats to undertake a policy of that kind of racism. And so, you know, as a kind of exploration of, I guess, what does that analogy mean to people who are using it in the 1940s? What are they trying to achieve in that analogy? I find this, and there are several other letters that are really interesting in that respect. And you know, I think students could ask, you know, you've brought a number of analogies into our conversation to slavery in the United States or Black Lives Matter today. So how do we use these kinds of comparisons to what effect, and recognizing that people did that in the past as well, kind of moving them across examples and trying to make arguments on the basis of that movement across examples.
Yeah, and I see here too, in the way that this Nazi that Nazis are brought into the conversation, that she is, one of the things she's doing is really appealing to a sense of Canada as being a just country, right? Like, I feel before God we have every right to protest this. This is what Canada, this is what we are fighting for. And she has to make that distinction that when she says we, she's putting herself as a Canadian citizen. And again, she uses our own country here as a way to say, like, as a way to highlight, like, Canada is supposed to be just, like, that's what we're fighting this war for. And it is interesting that using that metaphor is kind of this, like, this flag for, like, there's an element of injustice here that's supposed to go against what we are supposed to be doing, which I think is really interesting. Yeah. Oh, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, go ahead. Yeah, I was just agreeing.
Yeah, and I love how you said that there's a lot of things happening in this paragraph because, you know, you've gone against our wishes. And so, like, this notion of our and we is really prominent. And when you say that she tries a couple different tactics, like, we wanted to be consulted. This is a privilege. I really feel like I'm right here. I feel like God thinks we're right here. Legally, we're right here. In an international sense of injustice right now, like, this is really what we should be going on. And you can, I mean, as someone that has written angry letters before, although obviously not in any way like this letter, it's like, what do I need to do to appeal to you? Like, what are the different modes that I know that this is something that really needs to be addressed, and, like, what are the ways that you're going to hear me in the most in the best way for me possible. And I think it really demonstrates, for me, this letter really demonstrates, like, the commitment that someone like Aya had to being in Canada and being Canadian. Like, we want to be a part of this. We want you to see us as part of the country the way we see ourselves as part of the country. We're Canadian citizens. This is our rights as Canadian citizens. And I really, it's a painful letter to kind of hear that going back and forth. Like, how can you not see us the way we see us and the way we are acting, like the way that we are engaging in this conversation, which is believing you. We believed you, you know?
Yeah. And there's also, I don't know actually, but I'm not aware of a similar volume of letters in relation to the internment itself. Mm-hmm. That there was something about the dispossession of property, and some of the letters are very explicit about this, where they say, look, I understand that you implemented this wartime policy. But it was my understanding and my intention to return home to my farm that I've been working for the last 30 years when this is all over. And then when they get notice that the farm is being sold without their consent and at a price for far less than they would have sold for, they see something that far exceeds any temporary measure as a result of the Pacific War. And they're saying, you're actually now permanently destroying my life. Or, you know, what am I'm 60 years old. What am I supposed to do now? And we get these arguments that are put in these letters to try and convey that to officials, to try and convince them, like you're saying, that what they're doing is wrong, to try and halt that process. And sometimes I think also just express anger. You know, sometimes I think, especially properties are being sold past 1949, actually. I think the last property that we know of was sold in 1950. So, I mean, that's the other thing to just recognize as teachers of this topic, that these policies persisted into the post-war. And some Japanese Canadians are writing in 46 and 47 saying, what is going on? How can you be telling me you're selling our property when the war is long over? You know, how can you possibly justify this? And some of them by that point know that that these letters will not stop their properties from being sold, but they want to express their anger at what's occurred.
So, I mean, we've kind of gone over time, but this has been so fascinating. And I feel like you've already answered the last question, but we'll kind of pull out some things, which is, how does this primary source and primary sources like it, how does this primary source challenge our traditional understanding of this period? And one of the things I'm taking from our conversation is that it wasn't this kind of reactive thing to protecting the country. It was a longer process that government officials were aware that was in very murky legal territory, to say the least. The thing that you just said at the end, that it happened past the war, so it wasn't necessarily just this reactive notion, but also the strengths of these Canadian citizens who had Japanese ancestry to demand a place in Canada. And that, and like many things that I've talked about through the video series, that we can't just think of people who aren't white, for example, as being just immigrants to this country, that this is a longer legacy of how we build Canada, and part of longer kind of notions of settler colonialism that we need to address and recognize as part of our history, our longer history. Are there any other like aspects you really want to kind of conclude our conversation with about how this source challenges our normal teaching of World War II or even the post-war period?
I guess, I mean, that's a great, wonderful summary of some of the lessons that I hope that will be taken from this work. I guess the one thing I would add to that, not over and above the things that you've said, but just maybe in addition, is that in using the letters together that this resource presents to teachers, students will see and teachers will see really varied letters. Not all of them read this way. And so maybe one final thing that happens is using sources like this can start to chip away at a kind of notion that there was, you know, the Japanese Canadian community that responded in one way to being victimized in certain ways by the Canadian state. Instead, we see diverse people responding diversely to acts of injustice, and I think that the resources, I think, permit a much more humanizing way of understanding Japanese Canadian responses. So this letter should not stand in for all Japanese Canadians' responses to their dispossession. This is a very specific and very strongly worded. This is a, you know, a fiery woman, I think, and not everyone is a fiery woman, and so I think students who themselves are diverse, and you know, all of us are, of course, and we respond diversely to things that to injustice and to things to through really all aspects of our lives, I guess. And so I hope that humanizing facet also comes across without taking away any of the big structural observations that we would make about Canadian society, about this racist injustice. It's also a history with a lot of really lively people within it. And so I hope students and teachers will get to know some of those very lively Japanese Canadians, and even some of the perpetrators of this injustice also come across as people whose decisions we can grapple with in examining this history.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that just seems like such a great segue to the website. Did you mean to do that?
Pardon me?
Did
sale of the website? Well,
did you mean to segue to the website so well?
Well, I'm so proud of what the lead developer on this is a district vice principal in Richmond, Mike Perry Whittingham. He's been working for decades developing resources on Japanese Canadian history, worked with leading Japanese Canadian educators and organizations, and also, I don't know, the teachers I've encountered have been just amazing people,
yeah.
Just a delight to work with on this project. So I'm really happy for Mike that this is out. I'm really proud that our project was able to work with him and other teachers in developing this. And so yeah, I hope that the teachers who check out this video will find their way to the site. This is a kind of placeholder URL, and I think we're going to put the real URL at the bottom of the video here. But if you click through, if you go down a little further, you'll see there's a number of lessons. And if you continue down just a little further, I don't know whether there's a where's the protest one? It's I think a little bit up now. Sorry, now we're getting into. Yeah, so now you're down at the bottom of the site. We may be having lag, but there's a lesson called Protest.
Oh, I don't know if I see that. We'll just do a little...
Legacies.
No, there's nothing on this page that says protest, according to my handy little search. So I should just really clarify something that you had mentioned quickly, that this video is up after the site is officially launched, but we are filming it just a couple weeks before. So the URL isn't correct. The URL is below the video. And if you're watching this once the elementary site is up as well, that URL is below the video. And so when you as a teacher look at this site, it might look a little different than what we're looking at now, but I mean, the site looks so great that I'm sure it could be launched like this, and you know, with nothing missing. But protest is missing.
Well, we might be able to go more smooth. So I don't know whether we'll edit, but we can go more smoothly if you click under lessons on dispossession. So these are the 4 big lessons. If you click on learn more below. Oh, not legacies. I think it's the 3rd lesson. So if you go down below, if you go dispossession, yeah. So if we scroll down this page a little bit, should get to activities. There are some of the bureaucrats involved, and so we learn a bit about them and the folks who made that decision. And then if you go to activities, you'll find voices of protest activity. And if you click on just below that, there's a link, Voice of Protest Activity there. And this is where we'll find the letters, a number of other letters in addition to Suzuki's letter. Maybe is that? I think it should be. If you continue down a little bit, is it not there? Oh, I'm in the wrong spot. Okay, well,
it's okay. We're just testing it out. I mean, I think what's really great in like looking this is how the lessons are structured, and how there are like different ones that you can like do as modules. And I love, and if we go back to if we go back to the source, I also, and I mentioned to you when we were talking earlier that I ran the education exhibition program at the Archives of Ontario. And one of the things that I like to do is to do kind of what you all did here, which is just like to highlight, like, this is the source, but this is also how we can talk about them in a particular lesson. And like, this is the number. So we can kind of go back and forth when we're using it in our instructional suggestions. And so we might not have like landed on it in our little conversation today, but I think teachers will be able to find it. And of course, I'll put those links. Thank you so much, Jordan. This has been so fantastic. I love that we've been able to talk about this letter, and you've brought so much complexity to this history. And one of the things I talk about a lot in the video series is that we can't just bring in these stories as be like, okay, here's another part of the history, but we really need to demonstrate how they're counter stories, like how these stories can help us understand Canadian history differently. And I agree with you, like teachers are so awesome and they so much want to do this. And a resource like Landscapes of Injustice really provide them with a lot of tools to be able to do that. So thanks so much for coming on my little Source Saturday series, and I can't wait to promote the website when it is officially launched, although, of course, when people are listening to this, it has been officially launched. So congratulations on the launch, the future launch.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and thanks for starting this great series.
And all of the things that you talked about, including that link to the article in your book, are also linked below the video. So thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.